let me introduce Andy. I'm really excited about having her today. I probably met her about 10 or 15 years ago at an event, and I was really impressed with her and what she had to say and how practical and realistic it was. And then I had a chance to see her do a webinar about 6 months ago, and I thought, that's got to be the same person. And so I contacted her and we went out to lunch together, and turned out it was the same person. And I'm very impressed with what her thoughts are on branding and communicating. So let me just read off her bio here for you guys, and then I'll turn it over to Andy. So Andy Cunningham is the founder and president of Cunningham Collective, a marketing strategy firm with an expertise in positioning companies to win. She is also the author of the Amazon bestseller, Get to Aha, Discover Your Positioning DNA, and I really like that DNA concept, and Dominate Your Competition, and the host of the popular podcast, Marketing Over Ice. An entrepreneur at the forefront of marketing, branding, positioning, and communicating the next big thing, Andy has played a key role in the launch of a number of new technology categories and products, including the Apple Macintosh over the last 35 years. Today, she specializes in identifying and leveraging a company's position in order to gain traction. She advises startups on bringing innovation to market and helps publicly traded companies communicate their role and relevance to their constituents. Andy also serves on several corporate boards, is a Henry Crown Fellow, and the trustee in the Aspen Institute. She is a graduate of Northwestern University and lives in Sausalito on an old wooden boat, which I think she is actually in right now, with her husband, Rand Sigfield. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Andy.
Thank you, David. It is super exciting to be with you guys today. I know learning online is getting to be a bit of a drag. I'm hoping to make this a little bit exciting for you, and there'll be an exercise at the end, so there'll be definitely some interactivity. But basically what I want to talk to you about today is what you don't know about brand building that could actually kill your brand. And really the topic of this is positioning. Let's start off with my fundamental thesis about companies. I believe really that companies are a lot like people. And that's because they are built by people, they're designed to serve people, and they're made up of people. So really it's people who make the whole thing happen with a company. So when I think about marketing a company, I think about marketing it as if it were a person, if you will. So to that end, we've got these things that I like to think of are the questions that help you achieve what your North Star might be. And these are tough questions. So you'll see, and I think David explained already to you, that we're going to do this exercise at the end to build a message framework for yourself, what I call a message architecture for your project. But what we want you to do after that is take it home and do this for yourself personally. Because again, companies are like people. And if you can answer these questions for yourself personally, and you'll see how hard it is to do that, you will be better equipped to try to answer these questions for companies. And these questions are the following: who are you? Why do you matter? Where do you fit in the market? What will change because of you? And why is now important? So think about those questions as they relate to your project and as they relate to you personally. But first, let's talk about the three biggest mistakes that marketers are always making. And the biggest one is this idea of that people like to do branding before they do positioning. Brand is probably the most misused word in the English language as it relates to marketing. And branding used to start when many years ago. Branding was the act of identifying livestock with a brand. It grew out of that into the creation of an identity mark to establish or the identity of a company. And then from there, it grew to mean the touch, the look and the feel of that brand for a company, and then the customer touch points of that company, and then the experience that a customer has with that company. But the way I like to look at the word branding is I like to look at it as the emotional side of a company's identity, whereas I like to look at positioning as the rational side. So I'll get into that in a minute. The second biggest mistake people make is they don't understand who they are at their core. They don't understand their core DNA, and we'll get into that as well. And then thirdly, not having a message architecture, huge mistake. If you don't know what it is you're going to say to people, it is highly unlikely they will understand you. So let's dig into each of these things a little bit. The first one is this idea of the difference between positioning and branding. Positioning is the rational side of a company's identity or a person's identity or a project's identity. It's the expression of strategy in very precise phrases that convey a competitive differentiation and a role and relevance. So very rational, no fluffy adjectives. This is who you are and what is your role and relevance in the market. The branding side is the emotional side. It's taking that rational side and then expressing it in words, language, tonality, color, design, imagery, illustrations, all those things that touch our emotions. So these two things together, positioning and branding, when they're working really well together, they form the identity of a company and they form the essence of what a brand actually is. And the interesting thing about this is if you do positioning before you do branding, you will be far more successful. Just like acting as a human being, if you act emotionally before you think rationally, you're highly likely to make a mistake. So try doing positioning first and then moving into branding. So as I said, we're trying to get people to focus on the rational side of their company or their project or the person and answer those tough questions about who are you and why do you matter. And the point here is what we want you to do is stake out your territory and lay claim to it. If you look at the giant competitive landscape of a market, there are some empty spots in there. And what we're trying to do with companies is help them find that empty spot that they can own. And you got to build the foundation first and then add the makeup or the paint, not the other way around. This is a picture of Steve Jobs. It's a very famous picture of Steve Jobs. I was actually there during the photo shoot of this. This was right before we launched the Macintosh in January of 1984, long before any of you guys were born. I like to put this picture up here because Steve Jobs is my marketing hero. He was an absolute marketing genius. But Steve did make a mistake with the Macintosh, which is hard to believe this many years later, to believe that we did one of the world's most famous launches of that product with a great ad, the 1984 ad. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you look it up online. It is still a stunning piece of creativity and art. But we positioned this product incorrectly for the marketplace. And because of that mispositioning, we positioned it as a business computer when in fact it was really more of a personal computer. What happened was the product didn't sell. And because of that, Steve Jobs got fired from Apple Computer. So I put this up here as a reminder that even marketing geniuses can make positioning mistakes. And it wasn't until Steve came back to Apple several years later, after he had a failure with his second company, Next, he came back to Apple and he figured out what he had done wrong and he repositioned the product and realized that there was a cult following for this thing. And he doubled down on that cult and grew it and grew it and grew it. And that is why the product is such a success today. So he's my inspiration. The second biggest mistake that marketers make is they don't understand who they are at their core. They don't get what their DNA is. And this is kind of an important thing to understand as a person or as a company. If you know what you're made of at the core, you can make something of it. And that's true for people too. I like to think about if you happen to have talent for playing the piano, and you happen to be really good at it, you should use your DNA to create your brand. If you are a really great piano player, but you like to play basketball, but you're not very good at it, it would be a huge mistake to make your brand be about basketball when that's not really what your DNA is. So the whole point of this is to understand what you're made of so you can make something of it. So in my framework, I've discovered that there are really three kinds of companies out there. There are what I call mother companies. These are companies that are very customer focused. There are mechanic companies. These are companies that are very product focused. And there are missionary companies. These are companies that are very concept focused. Each of these three kinds of companies do things very, very differently. They think about things differently. They measure success differently. They hire different kinds of people. They train them differently. And that is how I know which one is which, is how they do those specific things. So what I want to do is give you a few examples of what each of these are. So the customer-focused companies, or what I call the mother companies, these are companies like American Express or Amazon, which has in the last few years declared itself to be Earth's most customer-centric company. And Nordstrom is another one. You also might be familiar with Zappos, which was acquired by Amazon. Zappos was founded by a man named Tony Hsieh. Tony Hsieh wrote a book called Delivering Happiness, all about creating great relationships with customers. That's what mother companies do. Mechanic companies, on the other hand, they win by building the best product or services, and they're not really all that into customer touch points or customer relations. A company called Oracle in the technology space is a great example of this. Sony's another good example. Even Facebook is a great example of this. They're really all about the product. And Microsoft. These are companies that really focus on features and the value of their product to create their position in the marketplace. And finally, the third kind of company, which everyone wants to be, but very few are what I call missionaries. These are companies that exist to change human behavior on a fundamental level. And they win based on this creative vision and this desire, this almost need to change an industry. Of course, I was lucky enough to work with Apple in the early days with Steve Jobs at the helm. They are totally a missionary company trying to change the way we think about computers. But Starbucks changed the way we think about coffee. Salesforce changed the way we think about selling. Virgin changes the way we think about everything from airlines to records and a number of other brands that they have. And FedEx, a long time ago, changed the way we thought about delivering packages. So if you exist to change behavior on a fundamental level, then you're a missionary person or a missionary company. And the third biggest mistake that marketers make is not having a messaging architecture to help you understand how to explain and express who you are and why you matter. So we have a tool that we've developed, and hint here, little foreshadowing, this is the exercise that you're going to be doing at the end of this session. You're going to fill out this message architecture as it would relate to your project. And then after you're done with that, we'd like you to go home and think about filling this out as it relates to your personal brand. All of you, I'm sure, are going to want to be out in the job market. You're going to be competing with a lot of other people. The competitive landscape is going to be ugly. The contextual situation with this pandemic is also ugly. And so how are you going to differentiate yourself? The top half of this message architecture, that stuff that's in blue, is all around the positioning side of your identity for your project or yourself. And the bottom part is the branding type or the emotional side of yourself. So what we're going to do is I'm going to explain to you what each of these things are and give you examples, but this is where I really need you to pay attention because this is what the exercise is all about. And at the end of this, you're going to be able to explain why your project matters and what its role is. So let's talk a little bit about those two, about how we approach this, okay? What I talked about a second ago, the circle in white is your DNA. I call that your core. So there's a way to figure out that, and we'll get to that afterwards. But we also want to look at these other 5 lenses of the marketplace. We want to understand what category is a company in. And category is a tough question because you can be creating a new category. You can enter an existing crowded category where everything seems and feels the same. You can create a subcategory within a category. There are many ways to think about category, and that's a very important question. In fact, my favorite category example discussion is to think about the MINIVAN from Dodge. Some of you might have even grown up with a MINIVAN in your house. MINIVAN actually emerged out of Dodge as a product that was the result of an overstocked inventory of chassis for a sedan type car. They had this problem of too many of these chassis. They weren't selling the car. And somebody inside of the company said, hey, let's put a different kind of top on top of that chassis that might create a different kind of vehicle and see if we can sell it that way. They did a very rudimentary version to start off with. It started to get traction in the market. So they built their minimum viable product. They saw that people wanted it and they began to refine and perfect. And pretty soon we had the Dodge MINIVAN, which was the inventor of a new subcategory of automobiles. Brilliant way of handling a problem. The second lens that we're going to look at in the industry is for your company or your project is the community you're serving. The community is not only about the company, the customers that you're selling to, but also all of the people who influence the purchase of that product. And when you're marketing, you need to reach out to not only the customers, but all of those people who influence them, who have to be knowledgeable about your product or service. The third lens here is context. You have to take into consideration context when you're marketing something. And there's nothing more contextual right now than this pandemic. And you can see advertisers, if you're paying attention to any kind of advertising online, you can see that many of them have pivoted their ads to be much more sensitive to the context in which we're living right now. But many of them haven't. I keep getting retail ads for ladies' clothing, you know, for high-heeled shoes and dresses and jewelry, then nobody's wearing that stuff. Nobody's buying that stuff right now. Those are very insensitive ads, contextually speaking. So you don't want to be insensitive when you're creating your marketing plan. The fourth lens here is competition. You cannot possibly hope to differentiate yourself, your project, or your company unless you understand how everyone around you in that same space is positioning themselves. So you really need to dig into what is your competition saying about what they're doing and what are the words they're using, because you want to use a different set of words so that you can differentiate yourself. We talked about core DNA already. And the final lens here is criteria. And this is actually a little test. So before we ask companies to get into this whole exercise, we want them to write down the 4 or 5 things that are important to them as far as criteria for a great positioning statement. For example, if you're developing a new product for millennials, one of the criteria for that positioning statement should be must appeal to millennials. So if you understand, that's what we're trying to do, is create a series of criteria that will tell us whether or not we've achieved success at the end of the exercise. So those are the lenses that you have to look to the market through in order to build a good positioning statement. Now we're going to go through the actual pieces of the message architecture, if you remember that slide I showed a few minutes ago. And I'm going to explain what each of these pieces are, and then you're going to think about how that relates to your project and then also to yourself. But I'll give you some examples as we go through. So the first one is purpose. This is a relatively recent addition to the message architecture framework for everyone. As millennials joined the workforce and took over for the baby boomers, the generation that I belong to, they decided that it's really important that companies mean something in the world beyond just shareholder value. My generation was all about shareholder value, but this next generation is all about making the world a better place in addition to shareholder value. So purposes have become something that companies are thinking about adding to their message framework. So, and this is super important for you as a human being, right? What do you offer the world to make it a better place? So there's a company called ServiceNow that makes a lot of productivity software, and their purpose statement is that we make the world of work better for people. And they spend a lot of time working on that statement, and I believe that their employees feel very motivated by it. But that's an example of a corporate purpose statement. Next, after purpose, is mission. And a mission statement is really what do you do every single day in service to your purpose statement, or what do you do every day in order to reach your North Star? It's a very mundane statement, hopefully articulated really well so that people can memorize it. I like to think it's really nice when employees can go home at night or turn off their Zoom at the end of the day, and they can say, I did something today that helps us reach our North Star. That's what a mission statement is. And Amazon stated this mission statement probably 4 years ago to be Earth's most customer-centric company. And interestingly about Amazon is they don't do this through touchy-feely humans talking to other humans and trying to make people feel warm and fuzzy. Amazon does this entirely through technology. And they're one of the few companies that have figured out how to use technology to become a customer-centric company. They're a great example of that. Okay, the next segment on the message architecture is what we call a target market. And a target market is really the market that you wish to serve with your product or service. In other words, they are your customers or your potential customers. That's who your target market is. There was a store for a while, some of you may remember this, called Forever 21. I think that they have recently gone out of business, unfortunately, but they had a very clear target. It was basically young women, and that's where the 21 comes from. And so that's what they were trying to sell to, is young women and women are in and around the age of 21. So think about who is your target market for your customer. Who do you want to buy your product or service? Then category, we talked a lot about this. So this is really the definition of the group of peers in which you want your company to belong. Okay, and yourself too. What group of peers do you want yourself to belong to when you're thinking about how to position yourself in the market for a job or for your project? So I gave you this example of the Dodge MINIVAN because it is my favorite one, but this is a very rare instance of a company actually creating a category. Creating a category is really tough. Usually the people who try to create categories get killed along the way because the incumbents figure out how to smash them or kill them. So it's often best to be entering a category that already exists rather than trying to invent a new one. because the real estate in people's brains for new category is very, very small. And so you better have something really amazing if you're going to create a new category. Like I think about Facebook, for example. A lot of people think that Facebook actually invented the social media network space, but that is so not true. There were many before Facebook, MySpace being probably the most famous one. And it's really not until several of those failed that Facebook actually hit on the right formula and succeeded. So while while they are a category leader, they were certainly not the inventor of that category. Then you got to think about what makes you different from everyone else, whether it's your company, your project, or yourself. And some people call this your onlyness statement. It's kind of your special sauce. So this product or this project or me as a human, I'm the only what that does what for whom. If you can fill those words in, then you understand what your differentiator is. And one of my favorite stories about differentiation is really In-N-Out Burger. I think you guys probably have all eaten at an In-N-Out. It's fabulous. Their special sauce is fresh and fast. So they have been able to come up with a model where they are able to offer fast food in a fast food environment, but it's fresh and it tastes good. And they do this largely by not having a lot of offerings. That's pretty much how they make it happen. And their target market is people who want fast food, but they don't want to compromise on quality while they're on the go. Great example of a differentiation in an incredibly crowded market. Fast food is an incredibly crowded and challenging market. And they stuck out this territory, claimed it, and now they own it. So the next thing on the message architecture is what we call a positioning statement. And a positioning statement is that clear sentence, very, very, very factually written, not a lot of adjectives, that really describes your point on the map, or your company's point on the map, your project's point on the map, or yourself on the map. It articulates your unique role and relevance. It's what you can truly own. And I like to say it's really your place in the sun. This is a really important thing to develop for any company or any person, because if you don't understand how you're positioned against the competition, it'll be really hard to win. So we did a lot of work with a company called Tile, which some of you may know. It's a little square, you can see a picture of it there where it says on top of My Keys. It's a little Bluetooth device that we positioned as the world's largest lost and found. And this was a great little product. It is still a great little product that it helps you keep track of your stuff. If you lose your keys or you lose your backpack or you lose your bike, if it's tiled, if it's got a tile on it, you're going to be able to track it through the gigantic community that Tile has created. So if you left your backpack at a friend's house in New York before the pandemic and you discover that you lost it here, you get on the app and the Tile will say where it is, and through the network of people in New York near where you left it, you will be able to get it back. It's actually a very clever little product. So their positioning statement is the world's largest lost and found. But you can see how that positions them uniquely and compellingly in the world of find stuff devices. The next category in this message architecture is a value proposition. And since you're in a marketing class, you've probably heard this phrase a zillion times. What is that business's value proposition? What's that product's value proposition? Oftentimes we in the market, in the business call it the value prop. But what is the highest value that your product or service delivers to your most important customer? It's also really important to understand this as you sell things, because the thing you want to go out there with to sell is that highest value that you're delivering to your product, to your customers. So what I like to use here is LYFT as a great example. So LYFT's value proposition is your friend with a car. And those of us who have done a lot of LYFT and a lot of Ubers, we really feel the difference between those two companies. And LYFT's value proposition is your friend with a car, whereas Uber has a very, very different one. Theirs is much more business oriented, much more arrive in style oriented. They've got a very different value proposition, same service, same prices, but different value proposition. And that's how they've differentiated themselves in the market. The next thing on the positioning side of the message architecture are key messages. Now, these are secondary points outside of your positioning statement that you want to make about your project or about your company or about yourself. So if your positioning statement, I'm going to go back a couple slides here to the positioning statement for Tile, the world's largest lost and found. there's some key messages that have to go along with that to further explain what Tile is. And in one of the cases, it's going to be the community. The community that Tile has created is really part of their story, so that has to be a key message. So what you're thinking about here when you're developing key messages, 3 to 5 points that support that overarching positioning statement, that you want to be understood over a period of time. And that period of time can be 6 months, it can be 2 years, but typically key messages shift more over time than positioning statements do. So you've got a hardcore positioning statement, and then you support it with 3 to 5 points, proof points, or additional things you want to say about it over a period of time. So I'm sure you're familiar with Peloton. That's the sort of interactive at-home spin product. And their overarching value proposition, as described by their CEO, is happiness. They sell happiness, but they have a number of key messages underneath that. So they're an at-home spin cycle bike, but they have 3 major key messages underneath that. One of them is in the comfort of your own home. The second one is that they marry sophisticated technology with great design and great fitness equipment. And the third one is that they use technology to bring group exercise right into your home. So this is how Peloton markets themselves with their key messages. And then finally, kind of coming into the end here of our message architecture on the positioning side of things, is the famous elevator story. And this comes from someone who long ago said, you need to be able to tell the story of your company in between 2 stories in an elevator. So you get into an elevator, you push the button for the next floor up. If you can't say what your company does and why it matters in that amount of time, then you fail the elevator story test. And by the way, if any of you are entrepreneurial and want to get out and start a company, many venture capital people will not give you $1 unless you have a really well-articulated elevator story and can explain what you do in just a few seconds. So this is your story in brief. This is important for companies. It's critical for companies. It's critical for fundraising, but it's also going to be important for your project in order for you to explain what it is you're doing to other people. And it's important for yourself as you get into the job market and try to explain who are you and why do you matter. So here's the elevator story for Netflix. Netflix happens to be a company that I call a mechanic. They're very product oriented. They have a very product oriented elevator story. Netflix is the world's leading internet entertainment service. That's their positioning statement, with over 151 million paid memberships in over 190 countries, enjoying TV series, documentaries, and feature films across a wide variety of genres and languages. Members can watch as much, here's their key messages, okay, that was their positioning, now they talk about their key messages. Members can watch as much as they want, anytime, anywhere, on any internet connected screen. Members can play, pause, and resume watching, all without commercials or commitments. There is nothing customer focused about that statement, that elevator story, and there is nothing concept focused about it. This is a very product oriented company, but they've got their elevator story down and they've supported it with some very good key messages. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move from the positioning side of it, which is the rational side, to the more emotional side. So in addition to having a good understanding of who you are and why you matter, now we need to be able to express that using the kind of language that is going to match with what your rational positioning is. So we do this through a number of means, just like we did the positioning side, and there are pieces of the branding architecture that are critical to have. Otherwise, you won't be able to complete this. So the first one is your archetype. And some of you, if you've studied any psychology and you happen to know who Carl Jung is, you may recall that Carl Jung invented the personality archetype for humans, and he came up with these 12 personality types. And while in his world they were meant to be applied to humans in the role of a psychological examination or psychological assessment, they also applied to companies. Again, I said early on that companies are a lot like people, and you can apply a personality archetype to companies. So let me show you a little bit of what we mean when we talk about these archetypes. Everyone knows Red Bull. Their archetype is explorer. Now, you'll note that they never use that phrase. It's really just their personality type. Hallmark, if you've sent cards from Hallmark or ever seen their movie series or gone into one of their stores where they sell ornaments, their whole archetype is caregiver. And IKEA's archetype is everyman. They're trying to appeal to anybody and everybody who wants inexpensive furniture. Not necessarily all that easy to put together, but they're shooting for it. So those are some examples of some archetypes. The next level to go into on the branding side of it is, what are the attributes of your brand? What are the factual qualities of your brand? Now, these are not the personality types. We'll get to that in a second. It's not the personification of your brand. It's the factual qualities. So let's talk a little bit about Mercedes, which actually has a number of factual attributes. And you need to understand the factual attributes of your project or yourself or your company in order to market it successfully. So in the case of Mercedes, their factual attributes are they're very engineered. Their products are very engineered, and they're known for that. It's German. It's expensive, highly stylized, has a deep heritage, and is desired. These are all facts about the Mercedes brand. But if you move to the next part of this equation on the branding side, we start to think about personality. What is the personified traits that define your company? So let's look at Uber. We looked at LYFT before. Let's look at Uber now. They have a very different personality from LYFT. They have a very masculine, powerful, professional, suave, and I'll add bro-ish down at the bottom, personality to their company. So that's the personification of the Uber brand. And you can see the ad in the middle, very, very Uber-esque. Okay, the next thing you have to have on the branding side of your equation is your brand promise. And this is really the commitment that you make to your customer that is delivered through your product. So the Colgate promise, and I think David will remember this from years ago, Colgate used to have the promise of whiter teeth. But what happened to Colgate is they got disrupted by teeth whitening products that came out as separate things from your toothpaste. So they had to come up with a new promise, and now their promise is kind of the all-in-one. It's more for your whole mouth. That's their promise. And that's what happens sometimes. You have a promise, and then you get disrupted by some competitor that comes in with something you never thought of. The toothpaste manufacturers back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s did not have any idea that there was going to be tooth whitening products that you could buy over the counter. And when that happened, they had to reposition themselves. So they did. Brand driver is probably my absolute most favorite piece of the whole entire message architecture. And this is a single word or phrase that best captures the essence of what your brand stands for. And again, a really great example of this is Red Bull. Red Bull has a brand driver of the word extreme. It is not at all something they ever say. They never say the word extreme, but everything you see, everything you watch, every event you go to, even when you drink the beverage and mix it with vodka, it has this feeling of extreme. And that is what they are trying to emit all the time, is this feeling of extreme. And this is a still from a video that Red Bull has on their website, which I encourage you to take a look at, which is, remember the guy that jumped out of the rocket from outer space and landed successfully and safely. That's a Red Bull. And you can see that Red Bull has sponsored him with that activity. Everything they do, everything they say, everything they communicate is extreme. Then there's tone of voice. Okay, now that you understand what your brand is supposed to sound like and feel like, now you got to be able to communicate that with a certain tone of voice. So this is a choice of language as much as it is a tone of language. And one of my favorite examples here is GEICO. GEICO is an insurance company, as you know. You might not know this, but what does GEICO stand for? Well, it stands for Government Employees Insurance Company, GEICO. Puzzled, are you? Well, that name goes way back to the beginnings of the company. This is actual copy from their website. So you can see that they've got humor and casualness happening in the way that they're talking about their brand. Not to mention, of course, their humorous ads and their mascot, the gecko. So this is a great example of a company that has found its tone of voice, matches up, aligns perfectly with their brand, and that's how they communicate everything. Coming into the home stretch on the branding side of things is, I mentioned before that we want to elicit emotion in our customer, whether that's a B2B customer or a B2C customer. And here's a listing of several emotions. There are more than this, of course, but there are, this is what you want to decide ahead of time. What emotion do you want the customer to feel when they are met with your brand? And of course, the best one out there, I think, is Victoria's Secret. The emotional trigger that they are trying to elicit is lust, and they probably do this better than anybody else. And they do it in all of their different means, but that's the emotion they're going for, and they've succeeded. Okay, the last couple things that I want to talk about as it relates to brand are memes. Now, memes are really fun things, and you're all familiar with memes because if you see this screen, you can see some that you probably know about. If you remember, you may not remember this Think Different campaign that Apple did when Steve came back to Apple, but the phrase "Think Different" became a meme for Apple, and he made it grammatically incorrect on purpose so that it would stick in their minds, and it would always mean Apple. If you think different, if you act different, if you are different, then you're part of the Apple cult. It was a brilliant campaign and a brilliant meme. Make America Great Again, another great one. Donald Trump is famous for memes. He comes up with them all the time. He had, during the presidential race, he came up with Crooked Hillary. Lately, he's got Sleepy Joe Biden. He comes out with 2 or 3 of these a week, and many of them stick. And whenever you hear them, like if you hear Sleepy Joe Biden, it's not just Joe Biden that comes up in your head. It's the entire Trump narrative and what he stands for and what he's done. All of those things come forth in your mind just because of that little package of a phrase. Nike's Just Do It is the same way. If you hear Just Do It, you feel the entire Nike brand, and they use their meme as a tagline, which is great. You might know TED, Ideas Worth Spreading. It's also their tagline, but when you hear Ideas Worth Spreading, you know the whole TED story. You know what a TED Talk is, you know what you're supposed to expect, you know how long it's going to be, and you know where to find it. It's brilliant marketing. Salesforce did the same thing when they came out many, many years ago as the no software company. So these are examples of corporate memes, and it's really a great idea to come up with these for your project or your company so that you can figure out how to put the whole packaging of your story into just a phrase of 2 or 3 words. Okay, so we've gone through all of these elements of the message architecture. The blue stuff is the positioning or the rational side, and the white stuff is the branding or more emotional side. And what we are going to do now is to just show you how this all comes together into a final picture, and then we're going to let you take a crack at it. So just quickly, we want to start with your North Star, with your positioning and how do you develop that positioning. You need to have your purpose statement figured out, your mission statement, your value proposition. You got to get your elevator story down. You got to understand what your memes are. You got to write the story about yourself. If you see what's going on here, every aspect of your business is guided by that North Star, and together they tell a bigger story. So what do you see here? Well, hopefully you see the Big Dipper, and it's a whole process of just simply connecting dots, finding the dots that are going to be first identifying the North Star, then finding the dots connected to that are going to help you tell a bigger story about yourself, your project, or your company.